Yeah, thank you, Heather. So, folks, welcome. Hope you can hear me okay. So, my name is Vibhu. So, my talk today is this concept of what do product organizations of the new world need, right? So, and so I call it like product ops, but you will see more about. I'll set up the introduction. I'll share my screen, and I'll walk you through sort of the post-COVID organizations, right? So when we look at the new companies that are emerging out of this last 2 years of where we have been, how does it look like? Okay. So I am going to share my screen and that'll give you more context. And then I'm also going to share my written presentation in here. So you should be able to read along with me later. So, but let me start by first sharing my screen. So, and tell me when you can see my screen. Um, do you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So I chose this topic. Let me make it present. Hopefully you can see this. So the topic is more about delivering value with product ops and what I mean by that. And how we can as the new world that's emerging, what we can do to get better at delivering products, right? So so a little bit about me. So my name so I work at Accenture. I have been this is my family. My wife and I and my two kids, we live in Washington State for many years now. In fact, today is my daughter's 18th birthday. So she's evening is going to be spent with her. I work at an innovation lab at Accenture, so we do a lot of product development over the years. I also am passionate about teaching and coaching. So over the years, I have an organization called Agilis, where we go around sort of spreading the goodness of Agile. So I've been practicing Agile and DevOps and all of that for many years now, right? So this really is around sort of my perception about how I see the world has evolved over time, right? So what is this talk about? So this talk is about, if you have heard about, over the years about Scrum or Kanban, or you may have heard about DevOps, DevSecOps. You may have heard so many terms that come along, and every 3-4 years we are thrown with a new word in front of us. But how do we make sense of all of these things? And is there a common thread that connects all of them? So this talk is more to connect the dots. One of the goals is to think about connecting the dots between all the various things we talk about, like design thinking, lean product management. How does all of that work? And also, we want to think about constraints and feedback loops, right? So how do we create constraints in the system and create feedback loops so that we can improve people, process, and technology, to get these methods that we use, right? So those are two goals of what I'm trying to achieve for this topic. So with that much, I want to start introducing a few concepts, and feel free to, if you want questions, you can put a text in the message and we can chat along as we go as well. So this may sound familiar to you, right? So this is sort of how we used to live, and we used to go to offices, and we used to, we had traffic jams. We would sit in these traffic for hours together, and then that's how we commute to work. So we had all these beliefs, and I call them orthodoxies, as a global citizen, right? So we had these orthodoxies about how we need to work, how products need to be built. That we go to the office, we do the stand up in the morning, that we do planning. There's a whole concept of office space, and all of that. Everything that we thought held as true was proven by this big thought experiment that happened in a year and a half ago called COVID, right? So COVID came along, and this is my new world now, right? So my new world looks a lot like this, where you, whether you like it or not, you end up in sessions like this. For example, this conference itself is used to be physical, but now we are off doing on our own, in a virtual world. But because of this constraint, right? The constraint was, the belief we had was we just cannot work remotely, right? The belief we had that we need to be in a physical space and we need to do work together in a face-to-face kind of a mode, and all of that, a constraint was created, and the constraint was that, hey, you just can't move anymore. You have to stay home because of COVID. because of that constraint, we had no choice but to invent, right? So we found new ways of working, and out of that new ways of working emerged products which were there but have now become a lot more real. For example, Miro or Mural or Zoom, or the fact that Uber does something different now, right? So there is lots of new emerging models coming up, which have sort of been created because of this single constraint that we created, saying that you just have no choice, you got to work from home, right? So what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about, in the new product organizations, right, that we are building, what are the core pillars that we want to see in any group. So, and how do we see them work? And this is true to existing companies. This is not something that is new. But in order to create customer delight, we want to have a group that thinks about, is this valuable? That's what we call as often as product management. You have sales and delivery and other parts of the organization. Sales, marketing, finance. Those are all the people in that product segment. Then you have the design folks who are thinking about, is this usable? Is this something usable? How can we make it more usable? And so they are all the designers who are working in our organizations. Then we have the engineering teams or the IT kind of teams, which may have developers, testers, DevOps engineers, security people, architects. So that's sort of the classic group that we have within an organization. Then supporting all of that is we have leaders thinking about, hey, do we have a culture that fosters collaboration, right? Now, obviously, our organizations are a lot more complex than that, but I wanted to simplify to sort of bring it back to 4 quadrants: product, design, engineering, and leadership, which we need to work together in order to create a constraint, and then we can create customer delight, right? So that is how we would like to see, right? But in our organizations, more so, it looks a lot like this, right? We have more of siloed functions, unless it's a startup or some kind of a new organization that has emerged the last maybe 6 to 8 years. Predominantly, the mainstream big companies of the world have these functions still working in silos. These are organizational groups that we have. So we may have a business group, which sometimes has the product people in it. We may have the design folks and engineering folks part of the IT group. We may have an operations group that will have the operations. And then we have within the engineering people on security and things like that. And they all have a leader who report up, right? So that there's a leader for product management, product side, there is a leader for design, engineering, operations, and the organization sort of scales up like that, right? So when you take an organization like that, naturally, for us to deliver value, right? So think about 2 things, right? Someone identified, hey, here is a value that we could probably deliver to our customers, right? So value identified. So maybe that is January of this year. And by the time we actually deliver the value, using all the various approval processes and the systems we have to work with within our organization, sometimes it's like maybe 8 to 9 months later is when we actually deliver the value. And sometimes it's a lot more in organizations today still, right? So that is what I call as lead time for customer value, which is like time that takes for us because of natural way we have structured our organizations for things to go further, right? So, but that kind of a constraint, that kind of a system gets challenged when you have things like COVID come along and you have new competition coming along in many organizations that are rethinking how we do business, rethinking what does it mean to use a certain product, right? So we need to be a lot more agile than that. The other thing is a lot of the things we have today have evolved over time. So like for example, Scrum and Agile. And so I wanted to give you a picture. So I went around, this is again based on my own experience. I started doing Agile in 1998, before even it was called Agile, right? So here I am 23 years later, gone through this journey. And here is sort of when I put my view into, I was just trying to understand, well, what happened? And I'm not going to go into the details of this, right? But if you think about the history of how we have come to where we have in our organizational design, we started with maybe lean manufacturing back in the day, right? And this is the 60s and 70s, right? Some sort of the classic Toyota manufacturing, was the TPS was sort of the premise of a lot of the work we do, the lean thinking and all of that. And then came along in the 90s and 96, like design thinking, Scrum and XP, which have been now there for like 30 years or so, right? So these have been pretty mainstream now. Almost all of them do work in many organizations that we have. But if you think about the origins of Scrum or XP or any of those practices, most of these origins were on the IT side. So a lot of them started in the IT side, so not on the product side, not on the design side, right? And then came along the Agile Manifesto in 2001, and then and then 2005, a group in Microsoft was trying to use Scrum under a guy called David Anderson, and they were like, "This is not working, right? So like the Scrum thing doesn't work for us because we're in operations, and in the operations side, hey, it doesn't work. Let's go look up something else." So they went and looked up Kanban in manufacturing, and then brought it to software and ops teams, and so they started. So David Anderson sort of became who released a book back in 2010, brought Kanban to software, right? The other big change influence that we had in the industry is Mary and Lean, Tom Poppendick's book on lean software development, which brought a lot of what was already in lean manufacturing into the software side, right? So since then, now it's been around 15 years or so, right? Since 2006, we've had then the DevOps. We had a couple of big movements, right? We had the Agile movement, that is our first one. Then we had the DevOps movement, and then somewhere along the line, we had the lean startup movement around 2011, 2008 to 11, right? Eric Ries brought the lean startup concept. And then we have since then had like the lean UX movement. And lately, if you have been hearing a lot of terms around the DevSecOps movement, right? So we have had a few less things in this decade in the last 10 years than we had in the past 10 years, but predominantly a lot of the things you're talking about in this picture never evolved from a business perspective, right? Maybe except lean startup. Lean startup did emerge for how to run a business, but lean UX or Kanban or Scrum or XP, pretty much all of this have evolved from an IT perspective. Right. So that's sort of just a history to remember as we go into the next couple of slides, right? So again, this is all information that we all have. I'm not going to go into the details of a lot of these things, right? But if you notice just a general pattern around a lot of these things, right? So the design thinking process, which was sort of made popular by IDEO and made more popular by the Stanford Design School, talks about using this discovery loop of 5 things, right? Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. At the same time, the lean startup mindset talks about sort of the build, measure, learn loop, right? So which is sort of what Eric Ries popularized, and many of us use it in the work we do. And then at Google, they brought this concept of a design sprint, which is a little bit more formalized way of working through design. And this is really Monday to Friday, you do a 1-week sprint, and we call it a design sprint, which is something I've done a lot, and I really like it. But that is to solve, it gives a structure to how you may do design thinking in a 1-week kind of a phase, right? And then we have lean UX, which is really sort of the design people saying, hey, I don't really know how to work with my developers because it takes a lot of time to work with them, and there's a delay in how we are working. So it's sort of like if there was a DevOps that broke the wall between designers and developers, that is called Lean UX, right? Which was introduced by Jeff Gothel. And it has been going on for a couple of years now, right? So Lean UX is like the idea is to improve the focus on the actual experience, not perfect the design. So it's running short iterations where we actually build working concepts and we try out with like customers, learn from that in really rapid loops. And so it may even be just like sketching is a great idea. And so there's a concept called pairing in Lean UX, which is also something we have in XP, right? Where the developer and the UX person sit together, they sketch something, because by making our work visual, we can actually learn better instead of some big upfront design that we do, right? So a lot of these things have emerged from the design perspective, right? So that is sort of what I spoke about, right? We spoke about the visualized thinking. That's what Lean UX is. We pair up, DevUX pair up, and the goal of Lean UX is to solve problems together, right? So what we see is we have a lot of these isolated groups of optimization, which we call a sub-optimization, right? You're optimizing parts of the system and not looking back, right? And so my goal was to look back and say, hey, what can we do different as we form the new teams and how that may look like. Okay, so the goal again was to look at feedback loops, right? So if you think about feedback loops into the work process we do, right? Frameworks like XP, frameworks like Scrum. So on the left side here, this is sort of the original picture from the XP book, which talks about the feedback loop. And I love this. I've actually done a lot of this, and this made a lot of sense, but XP by itself didn't catch up a whole lot for whatever reason. Scrum came along and it has similar feedback loops, much smaller. So daily Scrum is a daily loop, sprint demo is a weekly loop, and release planning may be a quarterly loop, right? So we have a lot of these feedback loops as well, but they're also optimized within the kind of framework that we use, right? So it's almost like we have a tool and we're trying to use the tool, then figuring out, hey, what do we need to do? And then probably use the things that make sense from these things going ahead, right? Because there's a lot of focus on things like Scrum or DevOps or XP or whatever we call it, without really thinking about the feedback loops and why we need what kind of feedback loops that we need to do the work that we need to do, right? And there are many pictures of, and then there came along the huge DevOps movement, and this is like, if you, for those of you who have been doing a lot of DevOps, I'm sure you can challenge this picture and maybe add some clarity more to it. But if you think about it, the DevOps movement sort of worked around breaking the ice between Dev and Ops, combine them together and sort of error proofing the what is now called as a DevOps pipeline, right? And in between, so we have this loop where we go from plan and we go code, we build, we unit test, we integration, acceptance test, we release, deploy, operate, monitor, and go back. So it completes the loop from the time an idea was conceived, or think of it as put in the backlog, from the time we did the design all the way to it goes to production, and maybe it's a whatever continuous delivery or continuous deployment. And then we come back and we measure using tools and that monitor in production, and then we continue the loop. So it's a feedback built in pretty much in every. This is a nice feedback loop that covers the entire life cycle, but again, it is only from the perspective of the development side. It's really an engineering focus, and DevOps, for those practitioners who love DevOps, is similar to agile mindset. They talk about a culture change, shift left methodology, right? And that we want to move things more upstream for us to do something that is for us to move things up, so that we don't really wait for a lot of approvals and processes in the system, right? So that is what we meant by this DevOps, sort of the momentum of DevOps, right? So with that, right, I want to just introduce another concept now. Lately, in the last few years, you may be hearing another thing called DevSecOps, right? So DevSecOps is basically the security team was mostly an afterthought in most organizations, right? But it was really important for the security folks to get involved upfront. And so the goal of the DevSecOps movement is to bring those security guidelines into the DevOps pipeline itself, right? So that we don't have to think later about what it does it mean to secure things in the pipeline, that we start right from the planning ahead, so that we have these automatically built into a DevOps pipeline. So for example, if we are making sure that any personally identifiable data is in the system, do we have the secure data is secure, those kind of things are automatically put into the pipeline, and therefore we may not have to go through these major approval processes and stuff at the end of the process, because if we wait till the end, things only get delayed. So DevSecOps is again a big movement that is to move up, like things that is downstream, shift left and move it up the pipe stream, right? But again, if you think about DevSecOps, that also is from the perspective of IT, right? So it's a lot about how we think in the IT, but doesn't really come from the business side, right? So putting it all together, right? So what can we do that we can, if we were to think about the concept of flow, and if we were to think about how we were to reimagine how we do work in organizations, what could we do a bit differently? And this is something that's being done in organizations. So what I'm going to talk next is not some new concept, but it is being done now in more many organizations. And that is sort of combining these concepts into sort of two loops, right? So on the right side, if you notice the picture, in most organizations, in most kind of product work we do, we have a discovery loop and we have a delivery loop, right? So in the delivery loop, we may have various processes like Scrum or Kanban or Scrumban or whatever, right? DevOps, CI/CD, DevSecOps. We do all kinds of things in the delivery loop, and our DevOps pipeline often, picks up at the edge of the discovery loop, and then it delivers all the way to production and brings the feedback into that, right? But we don't really have the discovery loop. Is often done by business people or often done by our product managers, and they go and do all the discovery using frameworks like design thinking or lean product management or lean UX, right? The things they use, stakeholder interviews, all of that is something that the upstream organization often does, right? So what if we can shift this, right? So what if we can say, instead of the earlier picture where we had design, engineering, and product as separate circles, what if we can combine them, which is what many new organizations are doing, that we call combined team, a product, that's a new team called a product team or a value stream team that is having product, design, engineering into one team. And so what we do is we move the pipeline a little bit more left so that it starts with the discovery loop itself and doesn't really have to wait until we actually start delivering something, right? So what could that look like? So let's look at that, right? So on the left here is just an example of one team, right? So if you notice here, that's just one team where I have leaders from product engineering and design and some kind of leadership role that's influencing the team as one unit, right? Now, we can take that unit and scale it. So here is an example on the right side. And sometimes people may say, hey, that looks like the Spotify model. It's really not. I'm not talking about the Spotify model here, but it's really around aligning your teams around value streams, right? So there is, for example, a very large bank, a global bank, that is now doing this and moving away from the other organization structure they had to something like this, right? So in this case, the entire pod, which may have X number of teams, are aligned around a certain number of value streams, and then they work all the way from start to finish together, right? So which means the definition of what work means changes for us, right? So let me go back and introduce that concept, right? So this is what I imagine, if I was trying to redraw, like, how would this look like without really confusing, more in the DevOps picture. And this is sort of what I what I tend to think as what I call as a ProductOps pipeline, right? So, but really, if you think about it, I've introduced this green loop here. So in most of the discovery process often has 4 steps, whether you use design thinking or lean product management or lean UX, whatever technique that you use, generally there is a value identification phase or a value definition phase. So here we think about, is this a problem worth solving? What problems can we solve for our customers, right? So sort of tied to your strategy is the value definition phase, right? So from there, many times we will say, hey, in order to solve this problem, what are some crazy ways to solve this problem? And oftentimes we call them ideate, and in different frameworks, we call different things. But ideally, we look at, without thinking about the solution, we're looking at many ways to solve a given problem. We probably pick one of them, and then we put it into the backlog to say, let's go try this one, right? In the previous days, we would hand it over to some other team, which was called the innovation team, or the cool people who get to do all the nice stuff, right? But most of the real teams actually have all the knowledge, right? So why, instead of introducing some other team, we want to make sure that the same team does the work itself. So we call it planning. And Jeff Patton, was one of the earliest person who promoted this idea many years ago, right? So we plan the work, and then here, instead of building the code in the DevOps pipeline, we are building a prototype, right? So a prototype could be a sketch, could be a high fidelity, low fidelity prototype, and instead of doing the build using some build tool what we do is we may skip that, and we may just do a test validate cycle, because we really don't have to go through this entire pipeline for this to work, because we are still in that initial discovery loop. The point is, let's combine the 2 loops, right? Let's introduce the work that needs to be done, give it to the product team, which is combination of these 3 roles, right? Into one team, maybe around 6 to 8 people in each team, and they will then do this. Either they will do the production kind of work, or they will do more of the discovery kind of work. Let's do all of that work using something, and again, I'm not a big a fan of either do Scrum or do Kanban or Scrumban. Do what works for you, right? But then pick the same framework for you to deliver work, because teams like habits, and with habits we can actually build something. So whether you are in the discovery loop or in the delivery loop, depending on what you're doing, you're still going through the motion of all of these things in the DevOps pipeline. So the shift left here is that you're introducing your ideas for ideating or the value definitions back into the backlog itself. So it's all part of the plan. So we need to build this into the plan right from the beginning and not have to wait till like a later phase and bring it in most organizations, like right now, a parallel process. We want it to be in one team. Right. So that is really, what I wanted to sort of highlight is how do we go on build these things, and that's what I call as the I think ProductOps process, right? So so with that, I want to pause for a second, stop sharing, and I would like to pick up questions. I also have a document which so because I have a habit of like talking a lot, I wrote everything up, so that you can read when you have time. So if you click this link here, I think that is the link, that's a document that I can share the document to verify did we cover everything that we spoke about, right? So, so that document sort of lists sort of my thoughts around whatever I want to present as a paper, right? So I'm going to share my screen now that you can see the same document. The document will look something like this. Hopefully you can see it as well. So we spoke about, and this is still going through, changes. It's a thought process, thought experiments. We find something you want to improve here, let me know. I'd love to improve this paper again. But again, the key takeaways for us was two things, right? How to emphasize, create constraint and feedback loops, how to connect the dots between design thinking and discovery techniques, and that so many of the things we have in the organization. And a little bit about me. So we went through the core pillars, in every business unit. We didn't really speak a lot about leadership, but leadership style influences. The culture you create influences how your organization actually works. We spoke about the concept of a lead time. We spoke about the product operations, the gap we have in organizations today. And then we spoke about this whole journey we have where we have so much to pick from. There's a lot of history we have, but a lot of the things we have is actually coming from the IT side, right? So we got to reimagine, and there's a little bit of introduction around each of these things. You can read on your own later. And it also gives about some common questions that these groups ask, right? So if you're a product, they're going to be asking these common questions from a feedback perspective. If you're a design team, you're going to be asking these kind of questions, right? So either you're doing design thinking or you're doing lean UX. And then they may be asking these kind of questions when they are working from a feedback perspective. This paper also gives you, again, an introduction to a lot of the things many of us know here about Scrum and Kanban, so I didn't really go into the details of those, but it sort of gives you a little bit about what these frameworks are and how they started and how feedback loops are impacted into that. And my favorite thing so far is the XP feedback loop, which should have been much more used. Somehow it didn't pick up a lot, but I feel like we could have actually benefited a lot if we had actually followed it, right? So, so that's, and then it concludes with some of the things I was speaking about in terms of the ProductOps and how that works, right? So we ended up with this picture, shift left, and we spoke about the ProductOps pipeline, which is really introducing the discovery and delivery loop, and people call it different things in different frameworks. Essentially, it's sort of we do two things: find what to work on and go work on it, right? And so the find what to work on, let's introduce it in the loop itself and actually have the real team that does the production work also work on the discovery work, which means the meaning of work changes. It's not just about writing code. It's about bringing creativity and innovation to the work we do and makes our work a lot more interesting than what we do today, right? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pause for any questions. And I thank you for your time.
Looks like we have two questions from the audience. One is there any example for ideate and value definition in product and ProductOps? What tools can be used for that?
Great. So I think that you're pointing out to so value definition. This is where I think the tools by themselves, have like the mainstream tools, I have not included them yet, right? But there are tools like aha.io for road mapping, or there are like, you could introduce the ideation part that comes from design thinking into your backlog itself. So you could probably use like tools like Jira and other tools that we already have. But the point of my talk is like less about the tool itself, but more about the people, right? That we want to include the same group of people who are actually doing production work to also do the discovery work, because it then is when creativity happens. That is where we can create new things together and ship things faster, right? Any other question you see here?
Yeah, we have one other. Did hashtag lead have a meaning that I missed?
Oh, lead was like no, lead with, I was trying to think something creative. I don't think, leadership, I think I was engineering design and something it came into. I was trying to put some smart word, but it was probably a bad idea to put it there, because everybody has asked me, what does lead mean? And after a while, I'm like, I don't know, I put something there when I wrote it. But the idea was like leading with product teams, right? So leading with, which we already have. We have in all our organizations, these product teams, but they just work in silos, right? They don't work like one team. So just leading with that kind of an approach where we work as one team, right? So, and bring it into the DevOps loop itself, right? The pipeline itself.